Okay, so before we get started with our day, I really wanted to frame the issue of the work that we're doing here on community colleges. And just a note for those of you who I haven't had an opportunity to work with before, my name is Kim Homer Vagadori. I'm the project director with the California Youth Advocacy Network. And when I started my time with the agency, I actually had the opportunity to work with the college program. So I'm very passionate about this work and have an intimate knowledge of the history because I got to lead a lot of the work that we did from almost the beginning of the program. And in our state, we are very fortunate that we have been working with colleges and universities for 25 years. We've had a lot of success, especially with our four-year institutions, but still have a lot of work to do with the community colleges, also with private, trade, and tech schools. The reason that we're focusing on community colleges today is one, these campuses are all over our state, and they're some of the most accessible schools for individuals in California to be able to access higher education. And so it's a priority to reach the students and the staff and the faculty who go to community colleges because there are so many. There's about 1.8 million community college students here in California. And so this is a really important population that we can reach and that we can provide support with. Also, I'm going to be talking about the governance of all of our public education systems here in California are unique, and it's easier to work with one governance structure than with private and trade and tech schools where we have to work with individual campuses because they're all governed at the local level. So again, that's another big focus for the community college work. So I just want to share as a primer, where are we at today? What does this look like? I want to know, and you're probably going to hear me say this a few times this morning, but we are in the middle of doing our analysis for any policy change that did take place during the current academic year, both at public and private institutions. We will be releasing our annual report card later this year. So I'm not sharing any new data yet. I might hint to some of the things that we're seeing, but what I'm going to be sharing is from last year and just letting you know where we're at and where we can be going. So I'll be covering some of the legislative efforts, then talking about system action, what's happened within our three systems of higher education in California, and then again, briefly reviewing where we at from last year, and then we've had a couple of changes, but where can we go from here? So I want to start by looking at state legislation and the impact of state legislation on our California public colleges and universities. So back in 2004, there was an Assembly Bill 846, that passed that amended our current outdoor air law here in California. We have an outdoor air law that prohibits smoking within 20 feet of state-owned buildings. So prior to 2004, that law prohibited smoking within 5 feet of government or state-owned buildings. So in 2004, not only did they extend out that perimeter from 5 feet to 20 feet, they also they purposefully added in language to include colleges and universities, because prior to 2004, they were not included, and therefore colleges and universities could just have anything or nothing when it came to outdoor spaces. In 2012, with leadership from the Health Service Association of the California Community Colleges, there was an Assembly Bill 795 that amended existing government code, which is what 846 did. It's the same code. And they added in language to allow for enforcement of the smoke and tobacco-free policies. And so colleges and universities, all public colleges and universities in the state, actually do have the authority to issue citations if an individual is in violation of a local campus policy. However, we actually don't recommend doing that, and we can talk about that. I can share some of the challenges with doing so and different practices to use instead, but do want to note that law does exist within the government code. And then in 2016, there was an Assembly Bill by Assemblymember McCarty, And what that bill had proposed to do was make all public colleges and universities within the state completely smoke and tobacco free. Interestingly, that legislation had really no opposition. During the process of the bill, during committee hearings, there was some concerns from a couple of community college districts that there would be a cost associated with the bill due to some language that required signage. And so the bill author removed that language so that the bill would not have required colleges to use signage on campus, and therefore essentially removing the cost associated with the bill. Once that language was removed, the bill really flew right through the legislative process. There was no opposition. It was a bill supported by both sides of the aisle. But unfortunately, when it got to Governor Brown's desk, he vetoed it. So this is the veto message from the governor. He said he was returning the bill without his signature. And he did note, and I think this is also important to acknowledge, that the bill would have prohibited the smoking and use of tobacco products at the CSU system and at the community college system. It did not require it, though, at the University of California. And there's a reason for that. The UC system has a different relationship with this than the CSUs and the community colleges do with the state. And so it's not uncommon for the state to have less regulatory oversight on some of the things that happen at UC campuses. And then he went on to say, but these governing bodies already have the authority to do this work, and they're fully capable of doing it at the local level. So essentially what he was saying is that we need to allow for local control. We need to allow for the governing bodies of the UC, the CSU, and the community college system to decide on their own whether or not they should go smoke and tobacco free. And so from that time, since that bill failed in 2016, prior to 2016, the University of California had already adopted a system-wide policy. And this was set by the Office of the President in 2012. It was actually a pretty quick policy decision that President Udall at the time had adopted at the recommendation of, on the staff side, the University of California had some concerns about staff wellness and concerns that there was secondhand smoke exposure with staff, that this was going to be also a healthcare issue for the system. And so they adopted a system-wide policy in 2012. It was implemented on all 10 college campuses, as well as all 5 medical campuses and all UC properties. So that's all of their state laboratories, all of the medical sites that exist across California. Every property owned, operated, or leased by the University of California is 100% smoke and tobacco free as of January 2nd, 2014. And so shortly there, I guess not shortly, but 5 years later, the California State University system adopted a similar policy for all 23 of their university campuses, as well as the Chancellor's office, which is in Long Beach, and then any other property that is owned, operated, or leased by the CSU system. This policy had actually been in the works for a number of years, but it was held up in HR. So opposite of the UC system, where UC adopted the policy coming from the staff side, but at the CSU level, there were a lot of negotiations with unions within the CSU system to make sure that this would not impact the workspace. And so I'm also happy to talk offline about how UC kind of handled this as a meet and confer issue, whereas the CSU system really handled it more as a collective bargaining issue. And that's something that we continue to see with community colleges and working with local unions. But what we found after doing this work with the different systems was that the community college system operates very, very differently than how UC and CSU work. I want to note that not only is the system the largest, it's the largest college system that we have in the United States. There are 116 campuses Those campuses are governed by district leaderships. There's 73 different districts. And then the districts are all governed by a board of governors and a chancellor's office. And so while the board of governors and the chancellor's office do provide oversight and guidance for the entire system, under state law, the districts are actually the ones that have the authority to change any of the policies on the operations of the buildings and grounds of their campuses. And so looking at this chart here, that middle tier, the districts and their board of trustees are the ones that are the decision-making body. Whereas with the CSU and the UC, that system leadership was the one that had the authority to create that change. And so when we're looking at changing campus policies here within the community college system, we first have to go to the district and we have to determine if district leadership has taken on that authority to change the policy or if they've given that authority to their campuses. This is regardless of the number of districts, or I'm sorry, the number of campuses that exist within the districts. For example, some districts may have one college and then the district office. And even if that's all that's in the district board of trustee is still the governing body. And so the district may say, we are going to set a policy for our district office and for the college, or they could say, we are still the policy making authority, but the campus president can change the policy if they want. It doesn't have to come through the district. And so the district is really important doing that work. What authority have they given or not given to the colleges within their district themselves? And then do you have to work with the district or just with the campuses? That's really, really critical. And then under the campuses are all governed by presidents and then college councils who sit under presidents and provide guidance to that leadership. So this is where it gets really tricky. And this is what Governor Brown was saying, is that from a statewide perspective, he didn't feel like the state of California should be making a decision on smoke and tobacco free policies, that should be left up to those 73 district boards of trustees. And so what we did was we worked with the chancellor's office at the community college system and said, hey, we recognize that you do not have the authority to change policy, but we would like your support in doing so. And in 2018, leadership at the chancellor's office, the board of governors for the community college system said, yes, we support all of the campuses within our system in going smoke and tobacco free. And at the time, the chancellor sent out a memo with the resolution to all of the colleges within the system and said, we encourage you to go smoke and tobacco free. This should be a priority, but they didn't require it. They can't require that. In addition to what has happened at the system-wide level from the chancellor's office, there's also other governing bodies within the community college system. One very important and prominent group is the Student Senate of California Community Colleges. This is the student leadership of the system. It is also made up of a lot of regional leaders who then feed into the system executive committee. And since 2011, the SSCCC has actually been adopting numerous resolutions to show their support for campuses with community college campuses and going smoke and tobacco free. The most two recent resolutions are important to note. The resolution from 2017, they did promote designated smoking areas, which wasn't obviously something that we were advocating for, but we included it because it's important to note that they did acknowledge that we needed to be advocating not just for smoke and tobacco free policies, but also advocating to ensure that students have access to treatment, so that we can't just go and change a policy and then walk away. We have to go in, we have to change policies. We really have to reform the entire system and ensure that if a student is interested in quitting, that they had free access to tobacco treatment services to support them in doing so. And then again, in 2020, there was another resolution that came through where the executive committee of SSCCC recognized that the smoke and tobacco free policy should be a legislative priority for the organization. And this is, at that time, they said a complete 100% smoke and tobacco free. So removing that language on the focus with designated smoking areas. And then more recently, I just want to recognize that this work really came from some of our local partners, the California Health Collaborative. A couple of them you'll be hearing from later today. Amanda, who works in the North State, and Katie, who works in the Gold Country region, and a student advocate who goes to Modesto Junior College, who's part of the STAND Coalition, went in 2022, late 2022, to the Board of Governors and presented and said, you know, we have disparities in policies at rural campuses, and we need guidance from the system on how do we address this, because policy change is going slow now at these remaining community colleges. And through that meeting, developed a relationship with a trustee member from the Community College League of California, and the trustee Kelly, who is also from the Humboldt area. He invited us to go and speak at their January 2023 meeting and request that the league start to use the model language that we have here in California, that our team worked with the chancellor's office on, as the league's model policy. So the reason this is significant, and this was adopted by the league, the reason this is significant is because the Community College League of California acts as the advocacy arm to the chancellor's office. So the league is an entity that districts can pay into, and then the league provides them with services. They will give them draft board policy language. They will offer them advocacy services. They provide training, technical assistance, and support. So the league is a really important member of this system, but they are separate from the chancellor's office. And they oftentimes also do advocacy within the Capitol for the community college system. And so prior to January 2023, if a college had reached out, or if a district had reached out to the league and said, hey, we need model language on smoke-free campuses. That's, if you look in the district's policy language, there's a board policy, which is the BP, and the administrative procedures, which is the AP. And typically, not always, but typically, those are BP and AP 3570. And so what they did was, when a school would reach out, they would give them two different model policies. One was written in compliance with state law, so no smoking within 20 feet. And then another one was a recommendation for smoke and tobacco free, but it was not fully comprehensive. And so they just allowed colleges, here's some sample policies, whichever you choose works best. So with this action, what the league did in January of 2023 is they said, okay, no, now if somebody requests model language, we're going to give them a fully 100% comprehensive smoke and tobacco free policy. And so this is just another tool to hopefully get more colleges to see, okay, this is a model policy. This is really the direction that we need to go in. And so the league has been working with their attorneys just to make sure that the language looks good on their end. I just want to note that our model policy language is language that we have developed in partnership in the past with Change Lab Solutions and now with the Public Health Law Center. So definitely have attorneys who have reviewed it and provided guidance. And now we're continuing to partner with the league to make sure that we can get the language finalized, and then hopefully do some mass promotion in support of and in partnership with the league to make sure that the policy templates are distributed to campuses who either have current policies that maybe aren't very, the language is 100% smoke and tobacco free, but maybe it's not very strong language, as well as to those schools that don't have a policy. And so where are we at? And again, this is based on May of 2022, but our findings from our last report card was that we have about 70% of our colleges and universities, public colleges and universities, that are smoke and tobacco free. So we've already heard the UC system, the CSU system, they're both completely smoke free. The community college system is about 62%. I do want to say that we have tracked some change this year. So this number will be changing as we release our new report card later this month. But of those campuses within the system, in the community college system, that are not smoke and tobacco free, it's really, really important to note that only 5% are still at that place of entryway. And the reason that's important to note is because the rest of the schools either have designated smoking areas or parking lots. And that tells us that community colleges have been working to change their policies for a long time. Actually, when we started to do advocacy work with colleges and universities in California, community colleges were actually the early adopters of stronger outdoor air policies. The challenge was back in the early 2000s, we just didn't have the science that supported 100% smoke and tobacco free. And so schools adopted designated areas in parking lots or parking lots only. We actually learned a significant amount of knowledge from those schools on what worked, what didn't work, what were the successes and the challenges. So I think it's really important to note that many of the schools who don't have 100% smoke and tobacco free, they do have some protective factors within their policies, and there might be hesitancy on changing policies because they went through the process not too long ago, and so to try to do it again seems like a lot. So just keep that in mind, that not all are we changing from that 20-foot policy over to 100% smoke and tobacco free. And so here in California, the way that the community college system organizes itself is in regions. This is set by the chancellor's office. This is not something that we create. So this is the list of regions. What our team does when we do our report cards is we look at policies by the different regions to see where there's some strengths, where there's some weaknesses. And so what I want to just talk about quickly is what are some regions where we can really prioritize some of our efforts? I know many of you on the call are working within those regions. I think the regional space is really important. I do want to note that we have one standout region, which is the San Diego, it's region 10, San Diego and Imperial County, and they have an A+ score because every community college and actually every public four-year institution in those counties is currently 100% smoke and tobacco free. So they've really excelled. So just quickly running through the regions. In region 1, there's still some policy gaps, and we're going to be actually hearing about some of the successes and challenges with policy work within this region later today in our presentation by Camelia and Dustin. In region 4, what's interesting within this region is a B- doesn't signify that, hey, that's not too bad of a score. But the reason for that is because some of the policies that exist in Santa Clara County specifically are those designated areas or parking lot only policies. So when we score, we're not giving them an F because they have these intermediary policies, but they're still not 100% smoke and tobacco free. And there are some challenges with the existing policies they have in place. So that's why I've included region 4. We're also going to be hearing about some work that is taking place right now in region 5 and some of the unique challenges that exist within that space. And then we just have some tricky stuff that is happening in our Southern California regions. A lot of the colleges in Los Angeles, LA Community College District made some not so great changes to their board policy last year. And so there's a lot of opportunity to do some work in Los Angeles and Orange County, and then also looking specifically in San Bernardino. And again, I'm bringing up the regions because as we talk about moving forward to continue to do possibly some statewide advocacy or at least some statewide organizing, these regions are going to be really important. So that's the end of the framing of this. I do want to note, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now to be able to talk to you all about this. We're not doing this today. We were really hoping to be able to use this conference space to do some strategic planning, to be able to have a conversation about how do we move forward? How do we use our collective power? How do we organize to do this advocacy work? And just didn't feel like we had the time or the space to do it, but we want to be able to do that. So I'll share this again at the end of our time together, and then you'll be getting this via email early next week. But we would love to invite anybody who is still working on community colleges advocacy work here in California to come together here in Sacramento. Next month, we'll be meeting in person, and we will be having a full strategic planning day where we can talk about how do we leverage the successes that we have, how do we collectively organize or work together in specific regions to really accelerate the advocacy and try to advance these policies. So with that, I will leave it open. If anybody has any questions kind of on the history of any of this, feel free to unmute yourselves, or you can put something in a chat box. And then if there's no questions, then I can introduce our next presenter. So I'll wait just a second to see if anybody has anything to share or ask. Okay, seeing and hearing none, then I'm going to transition over, and I'm really excited that we had the opportunity to include this morning's talk in today. If you were part of the talk yesterday, you heard a lot of our focus was on overall student wellness, looking at substance use and student mental health and how it's all interconnected. And today we're really shifting over to the policy side, but we would really be remiss to not focus on collective policy and system change and not just smoke and tobacco free efforts. I think that we heard a lot of the conversation yesterday about how do we not only prevent students from smoking or using tobacco products on campus, but how do we support them in living a healthy life, both free of substances, with strong mental health and a good space. And we cannot just change smoke and tobacco-free policies to do that. This is very collective. And so we're really excited today to welcome back Eng Ta. If you were not here yesterday, I just want to share a little bit about Eng. Eng is a licensed MFT clinician with experience in healthcare, college and high school, campus care, and community treatment. Eng has a long history of understanding and treating substance use in youth and young adults in various settings, and has worked with systems to integrate mental health and health service screening and treatment. Eng is a consumer provider that specializes in substance use, addiction and recovery, trauma, and systems transformation. With a radical approach to healing, therapy, and design, Eng does not think outside the box, but instead has a think as if there is no box exists approach. And today, Eng is going to be focusing on ways that we can really enhance the conversation from policy into whole system practice by breaking down silos and navigating the quadrants of change through addressing individual programmatic and systematic factors that contribute to tobacco, vape, and cannabis use. So thank you again for joining us, Eng. We're looking forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you, Kim, for the warm introduction, and welcome back, everyone. Thank you for having me again. And for those who weren't here yesterday, before I begin, I only have 4 slides. I don't do a lot of slides. I have 4 slides and we can get through them pretty quickly. But I also want to, again, level set and get us on the same page for those who weren't here. And for those who, there was a lot of content yesterday. So I just want to summarize some of the takeaways. And one of them being, this ethos, right? Dr. Yang mentioned very briefly, what is the ethos and how do we promote this ethos of health and wellness across the campus? Because if we address health and wellness, then substance use also goes down, right? Because substances oftentimes are medication, self-medication, or some kind of resolution to another need that is being met, the strategy. Right. So we look at it as an individual student-centered and staff-centered approach, and then a system approach, because there's a parallel process that happens. What the students are experiencing is a direct correlation to what the system is experiencing, to the community and the policies are experiencing. Students will feel frustrated when the system feels powerless. Right. It's a direct reflection of that. And so one of the other things I talked about a little bit was the stress and trauma, stress diathesis model. Right. And to summarize that very briefly, across just looking at campuses and individuals, the students or staff, you have a certain level of stress, a threshold, right? Then you have resources. Now, when your resources, internal or external, whether confidence or external resources, services, policies, are much greater than the stress, it's a challenge to meet that stressor. But when your resources are less than your stressor, it now becomes a threat, right? And this goes for both systems, as we treat systems like families, dysfunctional families at sometimes, but systems are families, are groups, right? And they can be the client or patient themselves, as well as individuals. What is the stressor of the system, and what are the resources? To Kim's point earlier, talking about the disparities across California, what are the resources allocated to those community colleges that may not have as many funds, or may not have the student body or the staff, the capacity to implement some of the policies or practices, right? And how do we leverage each other? So I just want to level set that as we take it from not just individual mental health, but the health of the system, right? One of the other things I also invited us to consider was getting rid of the term mental health. It is health. It is holistic health, right? And individuals, when someone gets injured, a physical thing, depression, anxiety perk up. It's a health issue, right? Athletes who can no longer play or taken out of the season are going to have intermittent anger, depression, and that increases substance use. And the substances that are easiest to get a hold of, that you won't get in trouble for, cannabis, alcohol, and tobacco, right? And there's a shift from being a social engagement to a very isolated usage of it. And that's when you start seeing mental health. But it's tied together, health and mental health. And other people who have extreme anxiety are going to show up unable to focus, have intestinal bowel syndrome, or issues with sitting still, issues with muscle tension, and migraines. It is a health issue. They're not separate, right? And so we see the same thing that happens in systems, but they embody it differently. When there's a stressor, the system reacts. So I'm going to actually share slides now. Does anyone have any questions about the summary I just gave and some of the talking points? Again, like yesterday, if I see anyone come off mute, I'm going to assume you want to talk and I'm calling you. All right. So I'm watching the channel. So I'm going to share a screen in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Can everyone see that? Perfect. All right. Let me make sure I just pull the participant window and the chat window out so I can see everybody. Great. So this is the 4 quadrants of change. Pretty straightforward, looks like it. You have the personal quadrant, the relational quadrant, the structural quadrant, and the cultural quadrant. This is what you need to transform within communities like colleges, systems, and the college system as a whole, the university system as a whole, and then the separate ones. If you think of it from a MFT standpoint, marriage family therapy standpoint, every community college is like a family. There are conflicts within it. And the community colleges are cousins of a larger family. And some cousins hate each other. Some cousins don't want to share resources. Some cousins want more resources and need the help, right? So that's the framework and the frame in which I'm going to enter into this conversation with. How do we treat these systems, right? So on a personal level, you have individuals and staff. It was great to hear, Kim, some of the policies that were driven by staff concerns about self-wellness, right? The policy and the policies that were passed were regarding staff wellness, irregardless of the students. But it was great. It still passed it because it still impacted the students, right? And so it's shifting so that it's everybody. So what are, on the individual level, what are the attitudes, behaviors, and actions or value sets of each individual, whether it's staff or student, all right? Or anybody who's impacted by the system. We also have to think larger. These community colleges, you have students, then you have people serviced by, like some students can't go to school unless you have the childcare facility on campus. Those little babies and kids on campus aren't technically students, but they're impacted by the college system and they influence the college system, because without them, you'd have lower attendance, right? So we have to think larger. What does this system entail? Who is included? Who's not included? And I'm going to use oftentimes Kaiser's model. I work for Kaiser, per diem, and I'm going to use their model oftentimes to talk about some of the disparities in policy and practice, right? And how Kaiser tries to move through that. Right. So when we talk about personal attitudes, behaviors, value sets of individuals, all these individuals make up that system. Then you look at the relational. What are these connections between the individuals, student and staff? Or when you look at a larger system, the campus and the district, the relationship. Can staff safely talk to their deans? Can they bring things up? And when they ask, I've worked with a community college, which was fascinating for me. It was the English department that reached out to me and asked for trauma trainings, because right before the pandemic, they started seeing the recession, and the students were coming to the teachers and saying, I can't eat, I can't write, I can't do anything. And so the English department came to me, and the psychology department didn't, which is absolutely weird for me. I was like, okay, you're asking for the trauma training, but the psychology department isn't. Are you talking? Are you the dean's talking? Because I doubt it's happening only in the English department. Is there a relationship between departments and campuses? Then you look at structural, which is about today, right? The policies and the practices, the structures, the formal rules that govern what we do, the structure of the chancellors in the districts and the campuses, and then where does the state sit in that? What is structural that we have created? And then there's cultural, the ethos, the unwritten rules, the vibe, the atmosphere. When you walk on campus, does it feel like home? Do you feel like you belong? You feel significant? Or is it just a place where you get your degree and you leave? Because we also know, and you can tell, areas where there's larger rental properties is because people don't feel like it's home. They don't belong to it. So then usually the front yard is unkept, where there's more rental properties, because it's not home. It's just a place you go to sleep until you find a better place. What is it that we hope to embody as a system, as colleges and universities? Is it just about the education, or is it about the investment in the people? And education is one of those products that we provide, the services, right? Any questions so far? So shifting that over, when we look at the quadrants of change, where change happens, anytime you change one quadrant, it actually influences another. So if one person comes in with the belief that changes this paradigm of, okay, I'm moving from just cessation or quitting tobacco to creating healthy and well students who are going to choose to do it, from harm reduction, but eventually that we eliminate, but on a personal level, it changes the relationships, right? The reason why you show up changes how you show up, right? For example, if I want to, the reason why my tone would change, I'm going to say a statement multiple times. Hey, what are you doing? Hey, what are you doing? Hey, what are you doing? Same exact words, but the reason why the tone changed the experience of it, right? So when something happens in any quadrant, everything else changes. If the culture changes, the structures will change, because the policies and the language of the policies will change. The nuances. You all who write policies know there's a lot of nuanced language in there, right? You can spend hours on one word. It can throw off a whole bill. So any small change impacts the rest, whether or not it's intentional or not, right? And later I'll share a link in chat. I'll share right now if anyone wants to look. Trauma Transformed is, they approach systems change through a trauma lens. Trauma Transformed actually has a policy audit tool. I helped create it years ago, and originally it was a policy and practice audit tool. You take this policy and practice audit tool and you audit every single policy and practice you have to explore what are the positive impacts and what are the adverse impacts, what are the inadvertent impacts, who is it meant to impact, and who does it actually impact? And ask yourself, how can we improve it, right? Innovations aren't creating new things, it's improving things that are there. Okay, so you can check that out, policy practice audit tool. There's also guides on there. But it's a great way to look at policies from an equity lens, because we also have to ask ourselves, who does it benefit and who's under-resourced, right? We're talking about that stress diathesis again, and that stress model. Support people down lifting that minimum to get there. Okay. So I wrote the names down. Ken Wilber and Stephen Waddell are the ones who kind of were the forefront when they came with this concept. Ken Wilber is a transpersonal psychologist. Steve Waddell took that transpersonal brought to systems, right? So next slide, you're going to see the waters of system change. This actually comes from fsg.org. It talks about what we saw earlier: structural change, policies, practices, and resource flows. Connecting campuses across each other, sharing resources. Yesterday, I asked Stephanie, I was like, hey, what is your policy? What is your program? What are those things that we need to know? What have you done? Who are the levers that you talk to? Share it with us so we can spread that across other campuses. So no one's starting from scratch. Resource flow, right? Then you have the relational change. How do we embody ourselves, or not embody, embolden ourselves to connect more? It's one thing when one campus advocates, it's another thing when a collective of campuses advocate for something, and a collective of students advocate for something. The student body come together where they're not separated or siloed, right? We have to de-silo. What are the power dynamics? Who actually holds the power in decision-making? Power by definition is the ability to influence. There may be people that have veto power. Maybe people have power that can shut things down, but we do not want to diminish and forget the power, the influence that the student body and staff have. What is a king without a kingdom of people? Nothing. So what is a school when the students go on strike? Nothing. It's a giant PR nightmare. That's what it is. We had a couple community colleges have that, where the students spoke up and subsequently leadership had to be changed out. Power. Reminding people who and where the power sits and how to exercise that power in a way that builds a relationship together. Then the last one is the hardest one, the mental models. See, the relationships we can change, the structure we can change, but without the mental model, the implicit, the ethos, the culture, the epistemology in which we build, the values that we hold as a system, without that, the relationship and the structures are surface level, right? Great example. I can roll out a practice and policy where I just get people just to ask each other, to build up relationships. You got to stop and ask people how they're doing every day. Yeah, that's simple. We just stop and ask how you're doing. Just build a relationship, build a community, right? No, it's not that simple, because and you see this often. This happens to you and we engage in it. I engage in it sometimes. I'm walking, someone says, hey, how are you doing? I'm still walking. I turn around and say, yeah, I'm doing great, and keep walking. I haven't stopped. Just because I gave a practice to implement doesn't mean the meaning behind the practice is held. See, asking how someone's doing is about elevating, highlighting, and investing in their importance, because time is the one commodity that you can't manufacture or recreate. So when I stop to talk to you to answer your question, it tells you that you are valued, you're significant, you belong, that you're worth my time. Just because I asked you how you're doing, the fact I'm still walking while I'm asking it tells you a different message. The mental model, what we value and why we do what we do, right? I love tobacco cessation because that is one of those structures that we have to do. And underneath, the things not said. We're not saying we're asking you to do this because it's about your health. We have to make it explicit. We have to call it out. We're not doing it for the sake of doing it. We're not doing it to make people miserable. We're not doing it just because it can save you money. We're doing it because ultimately we'd like to see people live whole, healthy, and well lives. But that part's not said. So the mental model has to be more explicit. We have to take the implicit and make it explicit. Because if we don't tell you our reason, some of the things we do just seem unreasonable. You can show hands or emotes, anything, type in chat. Anybody here have little kids? Yeah, I have a 6-year-old. If I don't give her a reason for some of the decisions I make, yeah, to her, they're unreasonable, right? Why can't I have chocolate at night? It's food. Well, chocolate gives you a restless leg and then gets you amped up. You're not going to be able to sleep. You want to miss school? Right? Without reason, without stating the implicit that we know, my request sounds unreasonable. But once I put and elevate and put, it's because school's important to you. I want you to show up. But if you don't go to sleep on time, you're tired. You want to go to school tired? No. Chocolate will make you stay up all night. Then you'll be tired. That took an extra 30 seconds. It took something that seemed unreasonable. They made it a partnership that was reasonable. That comes from positive parenting practices, taking an extra 30 seconds to explain the reason behind things and do it with patience, right? Unfortunately, a lot of our structures don't give us that time when we're working with systems. It's a rush and wait. You rush to answer, then you wait for a response. So we have to change that. And we have to name why we need the response or name the timeline. We have to make it explicit again. Any questions so far? Yeah. Even as adults, sometimes we have, we hear things and like, that's not reasonable. And as adults, we actually flex our power more. We just more likely to walk away or argue, right? And use rationale. Systems will do the same. Okay, so some takeaways. If you want to look this up, there's several articles, like 12 steps for systems change. There's examples in other primers. You can find fsg.org. What is the system change? It's about changing the mental model, how we see what we value. And I love how we're doing that here, talking about wellness and wholeness, right? The holistic approach, because it is not just one. Because what happens when we meet that need? Let's say all campuses are now tobacco free. What then? What is our next thing? Right? So we also have to dream again. So the takeaways: system change is about advancing equity. Again, asking ourselves those questions. Who does it impact? Who's under-resourced? And how does this actually roll out? What needs are there? Yesterday, I talked about nonviolent communication, and there's needs. Everyone has universal needs. Systems have universal needs, fundings, capacity. Then there's the strategies in which we meet those needs, right? Individually, we can meet the need of reducing stress or getting food different ways. You can steal your food, you can earn your food, you can make your food, right? Reducing stress, you can exercise, laugh, or you can smoke, right? Or engage in any other cannabis use. What are the needs and what are the strategies? On a systems level, what are the needs? Funding, capacity. We see, we don't have capacity, we can hire more people, but if we don't have funding, what do we do? Well, we can make the classes bigger, or we could just cut the classes. Right? Cut the classes. I don't need teachers to teach them. You just kind of have to wait a whole year if you miss the class, right? And that happens. It's reality when funding's cut. But you're looking at the needs and the strategies. People have no issues with your needs. As systems, as individuals, they have issues with the strategies. So we adjust the strategies. And again, we name the implicit to make it explicit, right? Fully embracing our systems change, we actually had to have funders. Funders had to be prepared to see how their own ways of thinking and acting must change as well. Because funding will drive policy, policy will influence funding, but funding will drive policy. Policies will drive practice, right? So everybody from the top down and from the bottom up have to be on the same page and understand what is this investment we're really diving into and what is the reality of the capacity that we have to do it. And that has to be an explicit conversation, as transparent as possible, right? Then you have any shift in systems conditions are more likely to be sustained only when you're working on the 3 different levels all together, right? Explicit, semi-explicit, implicit, which is the structural, the relational, and the transformative, the mental model. Is exactly like the public health model of doing any kind of intervention, right? You have prevention, education, early intervention, and then of course the legislative in the bills, which is, leads into prevention and structural. It's the same. Anybody have any questions? In regards to all campuses suddenly being smoke vape, would need to have cessation services and group available. Yeah, clubs even, yes. And there has to be like club events. We have to compete with other clubs that are promoting, let's say, parties full of drugs. How do we have a party for people who are sober? I'm sober 13 years. That's why I say I'm consumer provider, sober off of opioids and alcohol. I'd like to go a party where I wouldn't have to be around that. You have some students like that. So create those events. There's a need, meet the need. And it may be small, but it grows. Because then people start learning and have reference to, I can actually go to an event, not use anything and still have fun. You're giving people that first experience and they know now it's reality and it's possible. Then those may grow. Those who are actively smoke vape free, we need to understand they're experiencing loss of something. Yes, it is loss. Every time you replace something, you lose something, you have to replace it with something else. If I tell you to change the way you brush your teeth, it's easy to do. But if I tell you to stop brushing your teeth, it's going to feel a little weird. Right? And I also took away your need to keep your dental hygiene up. Doesn't make sense. Okay. So I'm going to share this last slide with the 4 minutes I have left. And this is, during the pandemic, there was a poem that was written, same storm, different boat. Collectively, the universities and colleges are in the same storm. Students are in the same storm. But everybody, every campus, every district has a different boat, different set of resources. How do we share those resources, the knowledge and the wisdom that we have in order to wait out this storm or fight the storm, to survive the storm? Right? That's the equity issue. When you're talking about the rural areas, the suburban areas, what are the resources that are not available? So how do we build better? How do we innovate? And I hope it inspires folks to change, because inspiration, if you're going to take anything out of this conference, there's so much I heard and I was inspired. Inspiration leads to imagination, then leads to innovation. Innovation can only happen when you're inspired. So I hope, yesterday's presentations with the data and the resources and just the models that are out there, the programming and the examples, I hope that inspired you to something. So we have 3 minutes. Does anyone have any questions for me? And I'm going to close the slides in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. I always count down in case it jars anybody. Some people get, have a negative response to the screen shifting, especially with bright colors. Vivian, I do see you off mute. Did you have a question or something to add? I heard a spike. All right. Well, the chat is here too if you're having mic issues. No? All right. Well, I appreciate you all. And yes, the framework, it's going to be a big shift. It's a paradigm shift. It's going to challenge us in our systems because we're used to doing things. We build a habit around, especially rush and wait. We got to build it. We got to make it happen, then follow through. We got to fight the habit. And if you think, let's say, changing the way you brush your teeth and you'll do that twice a day is a hard habit to break and change. Imagine changing a habit in which you're in. You've been doing things the same way multiple times an hour. It's going to be hard to change an entire system, but we can do it. We've seen it happen. Him showed us the data. It's happened. So keep at it. I appreciate you all. Thank you all for your commitment, your work, and really break down these silos. We got to do this together. We're better together. There's a whole system approach, right? Thank you so much, everyone.